Good morning, and welcome to another week of Journey with Christ. I'm your host, Mark Mitchell, a preaching minister here at the Park Avenue Church of Christ in Charleston, West Virginia. And I'm joined, as always, by Steve Fox, a minister for forever.
Forever's a long time.
Yeah, well.
Cut it off somewhere there. Or start it somewhere.
Well, does it begin to feel like forever at some point?
Yeah, sometimes when I get out of bed, it starts to feel like forever.
Well, now you do know that most people have several different varying careers in their life, but not Steve Fox.
I had one career.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty fortunate to have that because I know preachers that get moved every 2 years.
Yes.
They preach a moving sermon.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've been very fortunate just to have all those years with two congregations.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Mark, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing okay. I'm still recovering from the 1 hour time change thing. It's still my body.
Well, see, we planned that. The church planned that, and then we messed it all up.
Yep.
Yeah, because everybody's going to get an hour's rest, and you're going to get that back during your sermon. And then we didn't have church.
And then you went and watched TV all day.
I did. Most of the day I watched some things that were kind of interesting. And then what's got me messed up is this weather thing. I mean, 60 degrees one day and 2 feet of snow the next day. But I've told you why that is. You know why that is, don't you?
Yes.
Because Mother Nature's a woman, and she can't make up her mind.
Well, there is
sexist?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, accurate, but it might be sexist.
Well, as an old saying goes, I remember if in March weather, if you don't like it, wait 12 hours.
Just wait for a little bit.
Yeah, it'll change.
But I have one daughter, 5 granddaughters, and a wife and a couple daughter-in-laws. And the women that I have in my life, I wouldn't trade them for anything. I'm very, very fortunate.
Well, for a split second, I thought, well, he's either digging the hole in the grave hole, or he's trying to reestablish credibility with the women in his life.
Oh no, that ended a long time ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, before we get into it, I do know that what's going on in our world would make many people and a lot of us nervous, and it's understandably so. But do not forget, no matter what our circumstances are, the circumstances of the people of Ukraine now is beyond what we even begin to comprehend and understand. So remember those people today,
Yes.
every day, in your prayers.
And it's awful to watch it on TV. But when you see a mother carrying a baby or a dad carrying a kid that's 3 years old, and they're going to be walking a long way to get to where they want to go, and now they got to carry a backpack and a kid. I mean, it's unreasonable to even think about that. You said a little while ago that humans do that to other humans.
One of the most thought-provoking ideas, if you want to think about these kind of things, because I think you should, to the degree of our greatest abilities is to the degree of our worst capacities.
Yeah.
We can do wondrous things, but we can also destroy in the same degree. And we're watching some of that right now.
And
it's not one of mankind's
You know what I think most
better
countries miss? The Russians, who have been told by Putin to attack, to engage in warfare, those Russians who probably don't even want to do it and don't even know why he's such
They
a
have no
bad-
choice.
They have no choice. They got parents too.
Yeah.
They got parents who are waiting for their kids to come back. Just
Yeah.
like we got kids that want their parents to
Yep. So
be reunited. Yeah, it's a mess.
It is a
If
mess.
you and I could go to the world, to go to the
UN?
UN, we could figure this out in 2 hours.
Yeah, our credentials would not allow us in there.
Probably not, probably.
You know, because preachers, who needs those people? You know, that's the world we live in. You know, last week we ended up with, in Mark chapter 4, verses 10 through 13, where we have Jesus making a statement after he shares the parable of the sower. And before we move into our couple texts this week, I would like to reread that, and in light of what we're about to study, tie something together here. Jesus says, when he was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. He told them, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding, otherwise they might turn and be forgiven. You know, Steve, in one form, I remember someone saying to me, so Jesus doesn't want anybody to understand this stuff? And
If you read it very rapidly, that's what it sounds like.
it does.
I speak in parables so I can hide it from these other people because I don't want them to understand it and be given life.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with that.
Well,
Or is that where you were going?
yeah, no, but that's perfectly ties in, because when we get into 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul is opening up a line of thought here. But again, even after Jesus, the disciples, they had all this so-called insight into this period of time where they spent with Jesus, but yet, did they understand what was going on? Did they really understand what was the goal, what was trying to be accomplished? No.
No.
They knew, and their faith was in Jesus the Messiah. But what he meant by the kingdom, they had no clue. They thought Rome's getting kicked out and Jerusalem's back on top.
Yep.
And that wasn't what this was
We're
about.
going to have David and Solomon all over again.
Yeah, we're going back to the best years of Israel. Mm-hmm. Maybe even get it restored and have all this stuff. So what I want to say to people is, there are times you're going to read something and you're not even going to understand it. Does that mean Jesus doesn't want you to not understand it? No. It's not what it means. Not as I joked with Steve before, it's almost like Jesus is telling riddles, sit down and figure it out. That's not exactly what's happening. But what is happening is, as the parable of the sower lays out, which is the perfect parable to share this with them, they all heard the same thing, but the condition of the soil determined whether anything happened.
Yes.
So if you're...
And that looks like, and I would agree with you, that they had free will when they decided that.
Yeah.
Which kind of seed do I want to be?
Yeah. Well, and when any seed gets planted, it will grow based on the ground that it's in. And Jesus is just flat out saying in the parable of the sower, I can't determine the ground. You're responsible for the ground. All I can give you is the truth. What you do with it from that point is solely based on the condition of the soil that it's in.
Well, I mentioned last week that a lot of people probably either have skipped, I don't mean they did it on purpose, but they skip over that verse where it says, where Jesus said, do you not understand this parable? If you don't understand this one, you're not going to understand any of them. So that's the basis, that's the primary parable that they were supposed to learn. Every time I read this, I think of a girl in my class, Mary Ann, in high school. And she did this all the time, and it irked students and it irked teachers, but some students wanted to know the answer to it. We'd all be taking notes, whatever class we're in, we're taking notes, and Mary Ann would raise her hand and say, "Is this going to be on the test?" And depending on what the teacher said, of course, most teachers would say, "Well, you won't know until you get the test. I'm not going to tell you everything on." But she wanted to know, is this going to be on the test?
Is this
Because
important or not important?
If it is, I will study this. But if it's not, I'm just going to throw it in a waste can.
Yeah.
And Jesus said, this is the most important parable, so you better work on it, and you better learn it, and you better add it to your life.
Yeah. I don't know if I would go as far as say, he said this is the most important. He said, but if you don't get this one, you're not going to get the rest of them.
Yeah, so that would be him saying, this one's really important.
No.
He did.
Peter I'm not going to
Peter
go down.
didn't raise his hand and say, is this going to be on the test?
No, he didn't ask that. So, but he did Jesus did say, if you're not paying attention to this one, you're not going to see the rest of them.
Exactly.
Well, our next passage that we're going to, I guess, Steve, is 1 Corinthians chapter 2. You've picked out for us.
The first 5 verses.
The first 5 verses.
Before you read that, let me make one introductory comment.
Okay.
This is very hard, I think, for a lot of preachers to read this paragraph and say, oh, I see what's going on here. Because unless you've been a preacher and you sat at your desk on Saturday night scratching your head saying, what in the world am I going to say tomorrow? You don't understand the significance of this passage right here. But a lot of us have had times where there's nothing there, it's just blank. And what you wrote down on Monday
didn't make nearly as much sense as it on Sunday.
No, but it's starting to look good on Saturday. It's going, I would never preach that, but then you're over here on Saturday and going, oh yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to preach about that.
Hey, yeah.
It's difficult because Paul will tell us in this paragraph what the curriculum is. He will tell us and the Corinthians what they were supposed to teach.
And he's going to lay some interesting comments down in here that I think are very relevant. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. And so it is with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith may not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. Paul says this, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom. In chapter 1, Paul lays out a very foundational concept, actually, for any human who wants to study to sort out the truth of God. Because oftentimes, what we consider wise is not, and what we consider to be, that's not relevant, is. Our ability to determine what's the perfect thing and the non-perfect thing, our track record's not there. So, Paul says, when
he's narrowing it down.
He's narrowed it down. I've come here not with wise arguments to tell you this is what you need to do. What I've come with is the Spirit of God. I'm the vessel. He's using me to tell you whatever He needs to have you told, and show you whatever it needs to be showed. That is actually matching, sometimes tying back to this Mark chapter 4, matching up ideas to the soil that's there and seeing if God can tear up some ground all while planting.
Yes.
And Paul says, That's all I'm trying to do.
We don't use this word very often in a biblical context, but Paul is saying, here's the curriculum. When you teach somebody, here's what you're supposed to be teaching. Now, if somebody gets up and it's Sunday and you've asked them to preach, or I've filled in for somebody, and that you get up and say, I'm not preaching this morning, we asked Joe Henderson Hickenbotham, Jeremiah Snotslinger, we asked him to
Joe Schmo.
we'd ask him to preach. If he gets up there and says, man, I was a great wrestler in high school, I could really run track, my grades were really good, all the teachers just loved me, and you did that one Sunday, people will go, oh, okay. You do that twice, you do that 3 times.
You're done.
And here, Paul makes it really, really clear. I did not come with superiority of speech. In other words, I had some problems speaking, as most people do. Nobody's the perfect speaker.
No.
A lot of people have problems with that. He says, and maybe he even had some impediments with his speech. I don't know. But it says he does not have superiority of speech. And then the next thing he says, or superiority of wisdom.
Yeah, I came here with, I decided to know nothing.
See, because if we did that and said, okay, only one person can preach, we're going to take the smartest person who can preach, and he will preach all the time. Well, that wouldn't be fair to you.
I'd so appreciate that. But, I've often wondered, as I've joked with many people, if Jesus or even all the apostles, every person that's in the Bible, except for Luke, and possibly Judas. And I hate to tie those two together. Luke was a doctor, so he had some education. He would have gotten hired today. All the rest of them, none of them.
No.
Peter would have never been even looked at as a modern day preacher today, because unless you've gone to some school, they don't want you.
If you're interested in coming here, please send us 3 of your tapes. Well, what's the guy do? He sends the best 3 tapes that he has. He doesn't send the worst ones.
No.
And Paul says, that didn't make any difference, because I didn't come to you with superiority of speech or of wisdom. Now, Paul's a smart guy.
Paul is a very smart
Paul talks about his background and who taught him and what his background was in the Jewish leadership. But he was a pretty smart guy, and he says, I didn't come to you. I didn't come to you to talk about my wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah, if a preacher gets up and talks about his wisdom and how many degrees he has, and this is what I did, and this is what I've done in the past, Paul says that's not the curriculum.
No.
The curriculum is not talking about you.
No.
Proclaiming to you the testimony of God. Oh, now it's getting a little clearer. Here's the things I didn't have, but what I did have was the testimony of God. I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Right there's your curriculum.
1 Corinthians 15 again.
Yes. First sermon, the classes that you teach, the sermons that you prepare, the private studies that you have, your everyday life is supposed to be centered around the testimony, he says here, of Jesus who was crucified. So if somebody gets up and starts talking about their life, now that doesn't mean you can't use a personal reference. That doesn't mean you can't say somebody's name besides Jesus, but everything is centered around Him.
Yes. Well, as Jesus showed the guys on the road to Emmaus, everything centers around Jesus. This world centers around Jesus. It is perfectly okay to tie elements of our lives. I mean, I'm sure there's sermons being going on right now about in the pulpit on Sundays about war and the various elements that are there. And if you're not tying it back to Jesus,
there you go. Tie them together.
You're not connecting what Jesus intended to be talked about as far as the kingdom is concerned. The kingdom, was what Jesus came to establish in order to give us a place to be, a reality for our life, so that we can handle the world that we're living in, and to prepare us for when the kingdom is fully complete and established.
And there were a lot of times in the first century where people could have said, say Jesus gave them a parable to think about. And when he would say, if somebody was listening to that, or a group of people were listening to it, and they said, well, he talked about that parable, but he didn't mention Jesus. You don't have to mention Jesus' name to talk about Jesus. And so if there's a parable that you're working on or you're studying, just remember that parable is based on something that Jesus did in the kingdom of God.
He used illustrations himself.
He used the illustrations all the time.
Yeah, so we should not be surprised that, stories connect to people, but Jesus uses stories to get your attention and then shows you these two things are alike. And how are they alike?
And when people would ask Jesus, hey, is this going to be on the test? The answer was yes. All these things that I tell you are going to be on the test.
Yeah.
And they're centered around his personality. And
of course, you've got Paul making definitive statement in verse 5 that is, we almost need to have that one on every wall inside the sanctuary area.
Especially behind the pulpit.
Yeah. So that your faith may not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power.
And notice it's not just accept Jesus Christ. It's Jesus Christ crucified.
Yeah.
That's a big part of the story.
Well,
the major part of the story.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, to the people of Corinth, the story of Jesus' crucifixion is looked upon as folly, as foolishness. And because...
Why waste your time?
Why waste your time to worship someone who was crucified by the Romans? Are you people insane?
Happened every day.
Yeah. Why would you do that? We only worship people who are conquering heroes. Well, guess what? He was a conquering hero. In fact, Paul goes on to say in 1 Corinthians, I think it's later in this chapter, 1 or 2, where he says, if Satan had known what was going to happen, he would have stopped it. So,
well, here's something that most ministers or Bible school teachers probably wouldn't like to admit. Paul says, I was with you in weakness. So if we're getting a resume from Paul, like you said a little while ago, we'd never hire him. He wasn't married, couldn't talk very well, he wasn't all that smart.
Well, no, he was smart.
Yeah, well, he says he didn't come to them in wisdom.
I know what he says, but we know...
He had his tongue in his cheek when he said that. I was with you in weakness, and look at this, and in fear. Paul's life was on the line in a lot of places where he went.
More than on the line.
And in much trembling.
Yeah.
Even when there's nobody after him, he's kind of scared a little bit. And my message, now here's the curriculum. And my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words. Have you ever heard a preacher, maybe at a gospel meeting or a seminar or a conference or something, when he got done, he said, man, that was good. That was really good. I went to church yesterday with my oldest grandson, and the guy that preached, I have no hesitation to say this. He was good. He was really good. But if you go there and you hear something and you go, boy, that was really good, and then the next day you look at your notes and go, he didn't say anything.
Yeah.
What did he say that was important? You can get caught up in the theatrics, and there's nothing wrong with good preaching as long as that good preaching is centered around the topic of that good preaching.
Yeah.
He was in weakness, he was in fear, he was in trembling, and my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom. I know people that have said, you try to stand up there and beg people to become Christians, persuade them.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back here and put handcuffs on you and put a rope on you and drag you up here. Paul says that's not the persuasion that we want. That's not a part of the curriculum. Did you want to say anything about the last two verses?
No, I was just going, but with the demonstration of the Spirit's power, was Paul's declarative statement, and the point was your faith shouldn't rest on anything that I say, but on what you know and understand of God, what you see and understand of God. And the biggest, what would, in Paul's, given the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, what was the one, and part of what he said here in chapter 2, what was the biggest powerful thing that God did that they would know about?
A demonstration of the Spirit.
Well, I'm thinking the resurrection.
Oh, the resurrection
of Jesus Christ.
That was a great demonstration of the Spirit and of power.
And of power.
Yeah.
That would have tied up what he said there in verse 2. The very fact that Jesus being resurrected, if you don't, the crucifixion and the power of the resurrection, if you don't grasp those two elements, nothing else, Jesus says, it's good teaching, but it has no value. But those two elements change everything, and if you don't get that, then none of this is going to make sense to you. None of it.
And that's why it goes back in verse 5 to what are you looking for when you're looking for true wisdom?
Yeah.
You know, you can know some of the smartest people in the world that have absolutely no concept at all what the Bible says. They have no clue about the things that are taught in the Bible. They have no clue about the men and women who taught things in the Bible.
No.
But they might be, you might have a PhD, 3 or 4 of them behind your name.
Well, let's go ahead and go to our next text, which is in John chapter 15, and beginning with verse 9, we're going to read 9 through 15. This happened on the night that they're celebrating the Passover around the table, and Jesus is having what John would write as that evening that he laid out a bunch of various ideas for them. I'm sure their heads were swimming, because I can read John chapter 13 through 16 and my head gets swimming, and I didn't even have any wine, so anyway, John 15 9 through 15. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you.
Is there any
You could spend a month there.
Oh, gee. Is there any better relationship, or is there any better relationship in the human narrative that is better than calling somebody a friend? And Jesus said, I can tell you how you're friends. You're friends of mine, or you're not friends of mine.
Well, I know that anyone who's ever been in a really difficult predicament in their life, and even if it's not a difficult predicament, let's say it's the best day of your life, those things will virtually have no meaning to you unless you have a friend to share with it. Mm-hmm. Because when you're in your worst peril of moment, you need a friend who's there to help you and comfort you and give you guidance, and because that's what you want. You want a friend there. And if you've had your best day, sometimes the first comment or first thing comes to your mind, I can't wait to tell my friend. Jesus, what an amazing moment. Here he is, Jesus, the Son of God. The one who's about to die, at that table has already laid the groundwork to betray him, his friend. And do you think in Jesus' heart there was a moment in that night where he said, well, 11 of you are my friend? No. I think in Jesus' heart, all 12 of them were his friend. He didn't die for 11 good people or all good people. Mm-hmm. John writes that Jesus died for everyone. In fact, Jesus goes on to say, or earlier in John, he says that my death is for anyone. You take it up or you don't. That's on you.
Jesus had a friend who was a Roman zealot. He had a friend who was a tax collector. He had friends who were working for the Roman government. I mean, it's never, in your friendship, it's never 100%. From the time I was in junior high until I graduated from college, I had 2 friends. I had a bunch of friends, but I had 2 friends that were the closest to me and kind of still are. I shared with those 2 guys all kinds of things, and they shared stuff with me. When Susie and I decided to get married, one of the greatest dilemmas I've ever had in my life is, do I ask Dana to be my best man or do I ask Dave to be my best man?
Yeah.
It was tough, and I struggled with it a few days, and finally, it was almost like flipping a coin. Finally, Dana won because I had known him for so much longer than I had known Dave. I just had known Dave for a couple of years in college. But that was tough. And Jesus is saying here, there are a lot of friends out there, but you know what the characteristic of friendship is? Your characteristic of friendship when it comes to me is, if you keep my necessary inferences, wait a minute. If you keep my approved examples. what translation you got? If you keep my commandments, you are my friends.
Yeah. Well, in essence, Jesus is saying, you want to know what the friendship looks like? I've demonstrated it to you. Here's what I've done. Now, and of course, the debate over the commandments is the one that kind of gets controversial, because there's a lot of people want to bring in all kinds of things that Jesus commanded. But in the context, love God and love as I have loved in this particular moment. And he's always talking about love. He's talking about love in the fact that you love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. You love your neighbor as yourself.
And that's going to be on the test.
That's going to be on the test. This is where Paul actually, in Philippians chapter 2, doubles down on this love your neighbor as yourself. Paul takes what Jesus says to the disciples, and he ups the love demand. Jesus actually says right here, I love you so much that I'll die. I'll give my life for yours.
And it's not a matter of just loving, it's a matter of loving like he did.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
That's the goal.
Nobody can do that 100%, but that's the goal.
Well, that's your mindset anyway. Mm-hmm. And that's what Jesus, by this, if you want to do this, follow my command. And as you stated, nobody's going to be able to do that. But there is the condition of the heart that says, I'm going to try. I mean, I'm not going to accomplish it, but I'm going to try.
I heard a preacher use this illustration in a sermon. He said, all these people running around with their little bracelets on, said, what would Jesus do? He said, I live my life by that thought lots of times. But he said, I think a better question is, what would Curly do? If you go through life and look at some things like Curly looked at them, could care less. That stuff doesn't bother me. Those are traits of Jesus too.
Yeah.
I mean, he forgave people that obviously were very difficult to forgive. He did all kinds of things that you and I as human beings would never even guess that we're going to do.
No.
That's the goal.
Yeah, and as we're looking at it, as our narrative that we began this little section of study on, is the impact of what Jesus brought to the story. This is one of those moments, demonstrations, that Jesus bookends a concept here. I'm going to lay down my, you don't understand this, but I'm laying down my life for you, and there is no greater love among anything. God loves humans to such an extent that God will die a human death to save them. Now
That's the very definition of love.
that is the very definition of love. And that's what John goes on to say, that God is love. We don't even understand what love is unless God demonstrates it to us. We have no concept.
There was I was looking for this passage in Mark chapter 1. I tried to do this one time, but it was kind of one of those efforts that, well, okay, good for you, you tried. You may not have done it 100%. When I read this about, if you love me, if you are my friends, you will keep my commandments.
Mm-hmm.
So I started in the first chapter of Mark, and I marked it in my other Bibles. This isn't the one I was using. I started in the first chapter of Mark, and every time in a verse there came up something that Jesus did, I would try to do that day. Well, I was doing really, really well till I got up to the part about him going into the synagogue. And I didn't have a synagogue around me that was real close. Well, I guess I may have even done that. I might have gone to, because there's a couple synagogues, on the McCorkle Avenue that are really close together. I'd have to get my other Bible but I got stopped. There were a couple things I couldn't do, but Jesus did those things. If you make an effort to keep the commandments of Christ, you are his friend. And that's the way your life is going to end up the way it's supposed to end up.
Yes. And we've pretty much run out of time, Steve. I know that we went a little long on our first top subject, but 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5 is a very, very good verse, and we just took too much time in comparison to John chapter 15.
And the next time anybody prepares a sermon or prepares a class, they can ask themselves, when they read this, am I preaching Christ crucified?
That's right. Christ crucified. Amen. Well, on behalf of Steve and I, that will do it for us this week. We hope that you will tune back into us next week, and if there's any questions, any comments, or any suggestions, but be kind with the suggestions.
Don't throw suggestions out there. This stage may be empty in a week or two.
There could be. There's always a possibility. Well, on behalf of Steve and I, God bless and have a great week.